She weighed 260 pounds, and her sisters were laughing when they mailed the letter. "Nobody else is going to take you," Clara had said, still giggling as she licked the envelope. "At least this way you're somebody's problem instead of ours." Nora Whitmore stood in the hallway and said nothing. She'd learned a long time ago that silence was cheaper than fighting back. 3 weeks later, a letter arrived from Wyoming. A widowed rancher, 40 acres, 1 child, wanted a wife. And just like that, the family joke became something nobody expected. A choice. If you've ever been told you weren't enough, stay with me until the end. Drop the name of your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The Whitmore house on Caldwell Street smelled like burned coffee and old arguments. It was the kind of house where the furniture never moved and the conversations always circled back to the same uncomfortable truths. Who owed who money? Whose fault the roof leak was, and why on earth their father had left everything equally to 3 daughters when it was so obvious, Clara always said, that not all daughters were created equal. Nora was 31 years old and she slept in the smallest bedroom, the one that used to be a storage closet before their mother converted it sometime in the mid-1880s. There was barely enough room for a single bed and a small dresser, and the window faced the back of the neighbor's fence. She had hung a piece of calico over it years ago, not because the view bothered her, but because the neighbor's dog used to bark at her every morning when she opened the curtain. And she'd gotten tired of starting her days being yelled at by something with 4 legs when she already had enough of that from things with 2. She was not a beautiful woman. She knew that. She had known it since she was 9 years old, and Aunt Patricia had pulled her aside at a family dinner and said, with genuine concern in her voice, "You really ought to watch what you eat, sweetheart. Pretty only carries a girl so far, and you're not starting with much." Nora had been eating a second biscuit at the time. She'd put it down. She hadn't touched bread again for 6 months. It hadn't made a difference. It never did. Her body was simply her body, wide and solid and soft in the places the women in her family were narrow and sharp. She'd spent 2 decades trying to shrink herself and had only succeeded in making herself miserable and hungry simultaneously, which, as strategies went, seemed like a poor return on investment. By the time she was 20, she'd stopped fighting it. By 25, she'd stopped apologizing for it. By 31, she had arrived at something that wasn't quite peace, but was at least a working ceasefire. She existed, she took up space, and she had learned to move through a world that was constantly rearranging its furniture to make less room for her. She worked as a seamstress, mostly alterations and repairs for the women downtown who could afford better seamstresses, but appreciated Nora's prices and the fact that she never made them feel judged when the numbers ran larger than expected. She was good at her work, precise, patient. She could look at a dress and immediately understand what needed to change, where the structure was failing, what the fabric was trying to do versus what it was actually doing. Her sisters thought it was a fitting job for her. "Fixing other people's clothes because you can't fit into your own," Clara had said once, not even meanly. She'd said it the way you state a plain fact, like announcing the weather. Clara was 28 and had married a banker's son named Prescott, who had a thick mustache and thin opinions. She lived 3 blocks away and came over every Sunday for dinner, and every Tuesday to remind Nora of something she'd allegedly done wrong. Ruth was 26, still unmarried, which produced in her a specific and relentless anxiety that she managed by being aggressively critical of everything in her immediate environment, most especially Nora. Ruth had fine features and a bitter mouth, and a laugh that could strip paint off a wall if it was aimed at the right angle. Their mother had died 4 years ago. Their father had died 7 years before that. What remained was the house, the 3 of them, and a dynamic so calcified that Nora sometimes thought if she left, the whole structure might simply collapse inward like a building whose load-bearing wall had quietly been doing all the work. She wasn't wrong, but she didn't know it yet. The letter happened on a Thursday in April. Nora had come home from a fitting, Mrs. Calloway's Easter dress, let out at the waist for the 3rd consecutive year, and found Clara and Ruth at the kitchen table with paper and ink and the particular kind of energy that meant they had been up to something and were pleased with themselves. "What are you doing?" Nora asked. Clara looked up. "Writing a letter." "For you," Ruth added. Nora set down her basket. Something in her stomach went sideways. "Why?" Clara pushed the paper across the table. Nora picked it up and read it. It was a response to an advertisement. She'd seen such advertisements in the back of newspapers. She didn't read them seriously, just the way you notice a strange bird on a fence post, briefly, without investment. But she knew what they were. Frontier men seeking wives, correspondence welcomed, serious inquiries only, that sort of thing. Clara and Ruth had written a response on her behalf. Dear Mr. Mercer, I am writing in response to your advertisement. My name is Nora Whitmore. I am 31 years of age, unmarried, of good health, and capable in household matters including sewing, cooking, and general upkeep. I am not a slight woman, and I will not pretend otherwise, but I am hardworking and practical and would not burden a man with complaints. I am available to correspond further if you are interested. Sincerely, Nora Whitmore. Nora read it twice. The practical part of her brain noted that they had actually written it decently. It was honest, which she wouldn't have expected. The other part of her brain, the part that had spent 31 years navigating the particular texture of her sister's cruelty, understood exactly what this was. You already sent it, she said. Clara smiled. Last week. While I was at Mrs. Calloway's, yes. We found the address in the paper and thought, why not? Worst he can say is no. And honestly, Nora, you're not exactly drowning in options. Ruth had the grace to look slightly uncomfortable. Only slightly. This is a joke to you, Nora said. It's not a joke, Clara said. It's practical. You can't live here forever. Prescott has been very patient about, I pay rent. You pay some rent. And it's my house now, legally, which, you know, I'm not trying to be cruel. She said this in the tone of someone who believed it completely. I'm trying to think ahead. For everyone. Nora put the letter down on the table. She looked at her sisters. Clara, with her hair pinned perfectly. Ruth, with her fingers wrapped around a teacup, both of them watching her with the particular expression of people who have arranged something and are waiting to see how the animal reacts when it notices the fence. She picked up her basket and went to her room. No, she did not cry. That wasn't something she did easily, and even if it had been, she wasn't going to give the walls the satisfaction. Instead, she sat on the edge of her narrow bed and looked at the calico curtain and thought about the letter. The honest truth, the one she would not say out loud to anyone, was this. It had been a reasonable letter. Whoever had written it, and she suspected Clara, who was sharper than she pretended, had written it with a kind of unflinching accuracy that Nora herself might have used, if she'd ever allowed herself to consider such a thing. I am not a slight woman, and I will not pretend otherwise. She had spent her whole life pretending otherwise, in 100 small ways. Sitting at angles to look smaller, avoiding booths at restaurants, choosing chairs that didn't have arms, always choosing chairs without arms, because that one time at the bank, she pressed her hands flat on her thighs and breathed. She thought about the name. Mercer. She thought about Wyoming, which she had only ever seen in newspaper illustrations. Vast and gray and cold-looking, mountains in the background that seemed too large to be real. She thought about frontier life, which meant something very specific and very hard, and she thought about herself in it, which was almost funny. She was a seamstress who lived in a storage closet. She had never ridden a horse. She didn't know how to shoot anything. The most frontier experience she'd had in her life was a picnic 3 summers ago that had been rained out. She was still thinking when she fell asleep with her clothes on, and she woke up at 3 in the morning with the lamp still burning and a decision sitting in her chest like a stone she'd swallowed without meaning to. The reply came 11 days later. She heard the front door, heard Clara call up the stairs. Nora, letter for you! And the specific bright quality in her sister's voice told her Clara had already opened it and read it and was barely containing herself. She came downstairs in her work apron, hands still pink from cold water, and took the envelope from Clara without looking at her face. Dear Miss Whitmore, I appreciate your letter. I do not have time for elaborate correspondence, so I'll say it plainly. I have a ranch, 40 acres, and a son who is 6 years old. His mother died 2 years ago. The boy needs a woman's steadiness, and I need a capable partner who understands that this is a working arrangement and not a romance. I am not an easy man to live with, and I will not pretend otherwise either. If you are willing to travel to Lander, Wyoming, I will meet you at the station. We can speak plainly before any decision is made final. The journey is your risk to take. I cannot promise anything except that I will be honest with you. Silas Mercer, Stone Ridge Ranch, Lander County, Wyoming. Clara was reading over her shoulder. He sounds... Stop, Nora said. She read it again, slowly. I am not an easy man to live with, and I will not pretend otherwise either. The either did something strange to her, like he had read her own letter not as a liability but as a signal, that she was someone who understood plain talk, who dealt in reality rather than performance. Ruth appeared from the parlor. Is he a monster? He sounds like a monster. He sounds practical, Nora said. That's the same thing. Nora folded the letter. She looked at her sisters, Ruth with her small, sharp face, Clara with her banker's wife's smile, and she felt, for the first time in a very long time, something she didn't immediately have a word for. Not hope, exactly. More like a door that had appeared in a wall she'd stopped expecting to have doors. I'm going to write him back, she said. Clara blinked. Nora, we weren't seriously... You were seriously enough to send the first letter. She looked at Clara steadily. So now I'm seriously writing the second one. Ruth opened her mouth. Don't, Nora said. Ruth closed it. Us. She wrote 3 drafts. The first one was too eager. The second was too formal. The third one was this. Dear Mr. Mercer, I understand what you're offering, and I won't pretend it's more than it is. I can cook, I can sew, I can manage a household, and I am not fragile. I have never been to Wyoming, and I don't know what I don't know about frontier life, which is probably a great deal. But I'm a quick learner, and I don't complain about work. The boy is my main concern. I want to know if he's a good child or a troubled one. Not because I won't take a troubled one, but because I'd rather know the truth before I arrive than discover it after. I'll need 3 weeks to settle my affairs here. I can be in Lander by the 17th of May, if that suits you. Nora Whitmore. She mailed it herself. She didn't tell her sisters. The 3 weeks that followed had a strange quality to them, like the last days of a season. She settled accounts with her clients. She told Mrs. Calloway she was leaving, and Mrs. Calloway cried, which surprised her more than she expected. She packed 2 trunks, her good dress, her work clothes, her sewing kit, 3 books, and her mother's blue quilt that nobody else had wanted when the estate was divided. Clara tried twice to talk her out of it. The first time Nora just walked out of the room. The second time, the night before she was to leave, Clara came to her doorway and stood there with an expression that was almost something human. I didn't think you'd actually go, Clara said. Nora was folding a blouse. I know you didn't. It was supposed to be. I know what it was supposed to be. Clara was quiet for a moment. Then, it's a very hard life out there. It's a hard life here, Nora said simply. At least out there, it's a different kind of hard. Clara didn't have anything to say to that. She stayed in the doorway for a moment longer, and then she left, and Nora finished packing her trunk. She arrived at the Lander station on a Wednesday afternoon, 3 days after the train had passed through the last town she'd recognized the name of. The landscape had changed slowly, and then, all at once, flat brown earth giving way to something wider and stranger, a sky that seemed too large for the ground beneath it. Mountains in the distance that were exactly as enormous as the illustrations had made them seem. She'd barely slept. The train car smelled like coal smoke and other people's food, and she'd had a berth that was sized for someone considerably smaller, which had produced 3 nights of careful negotiation between her body and the available space. She was tired, and her dress was wrinkled, and her hair, which she'd repinned at every available stop, had given up entirely somewhere around Cheyenne. She stepped off the platform with her 2 trunks and looked around. The station was small. The platform was wooden and uneven. There were maybe 6 other passengers who'd disembarked, and they'd already dispersed. Beyond the station building, she could see a dirt street, a line of storefronts, a water tower, and the particular quality of afternoon light on high-altitude dust that made everything look faded and permanent simultaneously. She stood there with her trunks and waited. A man was watching her from beside a wagon. He was tall, not extravagantly so, but tall the way a man is tall when he's built from actual work rather than the idea of it. He had dark hair under a battered hat and a week's worth of beard that looked less like a choice and more like he'd simply run out of time. His coat was canvas and worn at the elbows. He had the look of someone who'd spent a long time outdoors and had stopped noticing it. He was looking at her with an expression that was absolutely impossible to read. She looked back. She was very aware in that moment of exactly how she looked, tired, wrinkled, too large for the space she occupied in most people's estimations, standing next to two scuffed trunks in a town she'd never heard of 6 weeks ago. She lifted her chin. He walked over. "Miss Whitmore," he said. It wasn't a question. "Mr. Mercer." He looked at her, not up and down the way some men did, cataloging, assessing, arriving at conclusions that showed on their faces before they'd even thought to hide them. He looked at her the way you look at a person when you're trying to figure out who they are rather than what they look like. Direct, brief. Then he picked up one of her trunks. "Wagon's this way," he said. She picked up the other trunk herself before he could come back for it. She followed him across the platform.
Ya sé, vamos.
They didn't speak much on the ride to the ranch. That was fine. She wasn't a woman who required constant noise, and he appeared to be a man built along the same principle. The road, such as it was, ran through country that kept revealing itself as they moved, fold after fold of land opening up into new distances. She'd grown up in a city of close walls and blocked horizons. This was something else. It was almost violent, the amount of space. "How far?" she asked. "Another hour," he said. "The boy, Eli, what's he like?" Silas was quiet for a moment. He handled the reins without looking at them, the way you do when a task has been part of your hands so long, it's become something else. "He's quiet, was talkative when he was small. After his mother died, he stopped talking much." "How old was he when she died?" 4. She thought about that. A 4-year-old who stopped talking. A father who answered a newspaper advertisement. A ranch with 40 acres and bills, probably, and a horizon in every direction. "Was it sudden?" she asked. His mother. Another pause. Longer this time. "Fever. 3 days and she was gone." "I'm sorry. It was 2 years ago." He said it the way you say it's fine when something clearly is not fine and you've simply decided to be done discussing it. She understood that particular grammar. They rode in silence. Stone Ridge Ranch revealed itself around a bend in the road as the afternoon light was going golden and long. It was smaller than she'd pictured. The main house was solid but not large, a wood-frame structure with a covered porch that needed new boards in at least 2 places. There was a barn, a corral with 3 horses, some kind of chicken enclosure on the south side, and a bunkhouse set back from the main building where she could see a lamp already burning in the window. It was not beautiful in any conventional sense, but it had the look of something real, something that had been built by people who intended to stay, that had weathered things and would weather more. There was a garden plot along the east side of the house, untended, with last year's growth still stiff and brown in the soil. She looked at it and thought, that could be fixed. A small figure appeared on the porch. He was exactly as small as you'd expect a 6-year-old boy to be. Slight and dark-haired and dressed in a shirt that was clean but slightly too big for him. He stood at the porch railing and watched the wagon approach with an expression of absolute neutrality that was both too adult and heartbreaking in the way that only children can manage. Silas pulled the wagon to a stop. He got down first and tied the horses. Then he looked at his son. "Eli, this is Miss Whitmore." Eli looked at her. She climbed down from the wagon, awkward on the narrow step, gripping the side, the familiar self-consciousness of negotiating a space not designed for her body. And when she landed, she was slightly closer to the boy than she'd intended. He looked up at her with brown eyes that were wide and watchful and gave away nothing. "Hello, Eli," she said. He said nothing. She didn't push it. She turned to look at the house instead, made a show of examining the garden, the porch boards, the trim around the door that was starting to peel. "Big garden plot," she said, mostly to herself. "What was growing there last year?" Silence for a moment. Then, quietly, from somewhere around her elbow, "Tomatoes and some beans. Mama's beans didn't grow good, though." She didn't look down immediately. She kept looking at the garden. "Beans are particular," she said. "They want things a certain way, or they sulk." "What kind of beans were they?" A pause. "I don't know. Green ones." "We'll figure it out," she said. "Might take a season to get the soil right." She felt rather than saw Silas looking at her from the other side of the wagon. She didn't look at him either. "Come on," he said finally. I'll show you the house. Down. The house was spare in the way that houses become spare when women leave them. Not dirty exactly. He'd made an effort, she could see that, but reduced. The kitchen was functional but joyless, the curtains sun-faded and stiff. The main room had a table, 4 chairs, a cold fireplace, and a shelf of books that were the only signs of any inner life at all. She walked through it slowly. "There's a room off the kitchen," Silas said behind her. "It would be yours." She looked at it. Small, but not a closet. A real window. A real view. Just the field and the fence line and the mountains beyond, but still. A view. "It'll do," she said. "I want to be clear about the arrangement." He was standing in the kitchen doorway, not coming in, arms folded across his chest, like he needed the frame to lean against. "All right," she said. She turned to face him. "I'm not looking for—" He stopped, restarted. "I need someone to manage the house and be a steady presence for Eli. That's the primary purpose of this arrangement. Anything beyond that is—" Another stop. "I don't want you to expect things that I'm not able to give right now." She looked at him for a moment. He was looking somewhere between her face and the window, the way people do when they're saying something true that they find uncomfortable. "Mr. Mercer," she said. He looked at her. "I'm 31 years old. I came here from a storage closet with 2 trunks and a blue quilt. I have no illusions about what this is." She held his gaze. "But I'd ask the same thing in return. Don't expect me to make myself small because it's more comfortable for you. I've had enough of that." Something moved across his face, quick. She couldn't name it. "Fair enough," he said. "Good." She turned back to the room. "Now, where do you keep the flour?" She made supper from what she found in the kitchen. It wasn't much. Beans from a dried store, some salt pork, cornbread from a recipe she had memorized when she was 12, because her mother had made her write it down 3 times until she had it. Simple food, unremarkable, but hot and plentiful. Eli ate 2 helpings without saying anything, but also without looking away from his plate for too long, which she'd learned by the end of the meal was his version of approval. One of the ranch hands appeared at the back door while she was washing up. He was young, maybe 19, with freckled forearms and an expression that was navigating between curiosity and something less polite. "You the new missus?" he asked. "I'm Miss Whitmore," she said. He glanced at her with the particular kind of look she had catalogued over 31 years. A quick assessment, a small recalibration. Then he caught her looking at him while he did it, and he had the grace to look embarrassed. "Ma'am," he said, and touched his hat and retreated. She dried her hands on the dishcloth. Through the kitchen window she could see the last of the light dying over the mountains. A slow red bleed across the horizon, like something that had been held in and finally let go. The barn was a dark shape against it. The corral fence ran in a crooked line she'd have to learn to navigate. The garden was just visible at the edge of the window. A dark rectangle of earth waiting for spring. She'd never done this before. Any of it. She didn't know how to build a fire that burned through the night without attention. She didn't know how to read weather in a sky that seemed to function by different rules. She didn't know the land, the horse, the bunkhouse politics, the particular geography of this man's grief or this boy's silence. She knew her own hands. She knew how to assess a failing thing and find the place where it was trying to hold together. She knew how to do the necessary work without a lot of fuss. It would have to be enough. She picked up a candle and walked to her room. She sat on the edge of a mattress that was firmer than she was used to and looked at the dark window and thought, "This is real now. This is the thing you chose." Somewhere in the house, she could hear Silas's boots on the floorboards. Slow, heavy, the walk of a man who'd been walking the same boards for years and didn't need light to navigate them. She heard him check on Eli. She heard a door close. She listened to the land outside settling into night. Strange land, strange quiet, strange sky. She would need better boots. The thought arrived so practically, so simply, that she almost laughed. Almost because she was still a little too tired and a little too full of the day's strangeness for full laughter. But almost. She lay down on the firm mattress with her mother's blue quilt pulled to her chin and the window full of mountain dark, and for the first time in a very long time, she slept without dreaming of smaller rooms. Morning came the way Wyoming mornings apparently always did, sudden and cold and without apology. She was up before the sun. She found the kitchen fire already started, which meant Silas had been up even earlier, and she stoked it and put water on and found the coffee, which was the one thing in the kitchen that was well stocked. And she made a pot strong enough to stand a spoon in, which she'd always believed was the only kind worth making. Silas appeared at the kitchen door just as the sky was going gray-pink through the window. He stopped when he saw her standing at the stove. "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to," she said. "Sit down." He sat down. She poured him coffee. He wrapped both hands around the cup and looked into it for a moment in the particular way of early morning when the brain is still negotiating with the day. "How did you sleep?" he asked. "Well," she said. It was true. She looked at him. He looked like a man who hadn't slept well in some time. Dark under the eyes, something taut in his jaw. "You?" "Fine," he said. She didn't push it. Eli appeared at 6, dressed but with his shirt on backwards, and she noticed but didn't say anything, only turned him gently by the shoulders when he stopped beside her to look at the stove and fixed the collar in about 4 seconds flat. He looked up at her. "The eggs," she said, pointing at the back door. "Are they collected in the morning or the evening?" "Morning," he said. "I do them." "Then you should go do them," she said, "and I'll have something ready when you get back." He went. She heard the screen door. Silas was watching her across his coffee cup. "What?" she asked. "Nothing," he said, but his voice had something different in it, something that was trying to decide what it was. Outside, somewhere near the chicken enclosure, a small boy was talking to the hens, a low, serious murmur she could just barely hear through the door, the sound of someone who had learned to save his words for the audience that wouldn't disappoint him. She cracked 6 eggs into the pan and thought, "All right then. We start here." The first week at Stone Ridge was an education in everything Nora didn't know, delivered without mercy and without pause. She learned that the water pump behind the house seized if the temperature dropped below a certain point in the night, and that the certain point was apparently every night in May. She learned that the stove had a particular temper. If you loaded the wood wrong, it smoked back into the kitchen instead of drawing up the flue, which she discovered at 5:30 on her second morning when the entire kitchen filled with gray smoke and Eli appeared in the doorway in his nightshirt coughing and looking at her with the expression of someone who had expected this. "You have to open the damper first," he said between coughs. "I see that now," she said. She learned that the 2 ranch hands, the freckled one, whose name was Danny, and an older, quieter man named Walt, who had arms like rope and said approximately 11 words per day, operated on a schedule she was not privy to, and ate at times that bore no consistent relationship to the hours she'd been cooking. The first 2 days she made supper at 6, and both men had already eaten something from their own stores in the bunkhouse. The third day she went directly to Walt, who was mending a fence post, and said, "What time do you actually eat?" Walt looked at her from under the brim of his hat. 7:30, he said. "Was 7 before, when Mrs. Mercer was alive." 7:30 it is, she said, and walked back to the house. Silas watched this exchange from the corral and said nothing. But that evening at 7:30, both men appeared at the back door without being called, and Walt said, "Ma'am," when she handed him a plate, which was more than she'd gotten from him in 3 days combined. Small victories. She had learned to count them. The town was a different matter. Silas had to take the wagon into Lander on her 5th day at the ranch. Supplies, and something at the feed store that required his signature. He asked if she wanted to come, and she said yes, partly because she needed thread, and partly because she understood that whatever the town thought of her, she'd rather know it directly than have it arrive secondhand. Lander was not a large town, but it had the particular social density of small places where everyone's business was effectively public, and the arrival of a mail-order bride was, she gathered, something of an event. She could feel the attention the moment she stepped down from the wagon. Not aggressive, just present. The way a room goes slightly quieter when an unfamiliar person walks in. She walked into the dry goods store behind Silas, with her chin at its usual height and her face arranged in its usual working expression. Pleasant, unrevealing, getting on with things. The woman behind the counter was maybe 50, with gray-streaked hair and reading glasses pushed up on her forehead. She looked at Nora with frank curiosity, and then at Silas, and then back at Nora. "This is Miss Whitmore," Silas said. "She's staying at Stone Ridge." The woman, whose name turned out to be Mrs. Greer, said, "I see," in a tone that contained multitudes, and then proceeded to help Nora find her thread with perfect courtesy and the careful politeness of someone who was saving her actual opinion for later. The actual opinion arrived about 20 minutes later, when Nora was examining a bolt of cotton near the back of the store, and two women came in and spoke to Mrs. Greer in the low, carrying voices of people who believe they cannot be heard. "The advertisement bride? I heard she was coming." "Well, she's here." A pause. "Lord, she's—" "I know." What was he thinking? He wasn't thinking. That's the issue. Poor Eli. First he loses his mother, and now he gets— Nora set down the bolt of cotton. She carried her thread to the counter, paid for it, thanked Mrs. Greer with complete composure, and walked outside to wait by the wagon. She stood in the street in the Wyoming afternoon sun and breathed through her nose for a moment. She had heard worse. She had heard worse in her own home from people who were supposed to love her. These women didn't even know her name. Their opinion was worth exactly what she decided it was worth, and she decided it was worth nothing, and she put it in the same place she put most of the things that tried to diminish her. A specific internal shelf, high up, where things were placed not forgotten, but rendered irrelevant. She was still standing there when Silas came out of the feed store across the street and crossed to her. He looked at her face and then, briefly, at the store. "You heard something," he said. "I hear things everywhere," she said. "It's fine." He looked at her for another moment. "It's not fine, but it won't last." "No," she agreed. "It won't." He didn't offer her comfort, and she didn't ask for any. They got back in the wagon and drove home, and that was the end of it, or at least the end of discussing it, which was close enough. What stayed with her wasn't the words themselves, but the part about Eli. Poor Eli. She thought about that on the ride back, watching the boy from the corner of her eye. He'd come into town too, perched in the wagon bed with his knees drawn up, and he was currently watching a hawk circle something in a field with his usual focused silence. She needed to do better by him. She wasn't sure yet what that looked like. She only knew that a 6-year-old boy who saved his words for chickens was a boy who had learned that people were unreliable audiences, and she understood that particular lesson intimately, and she was not going to be another person who confirmed it. The hawk dropped. Eli watched it land and stood briefly in the wagon to see better. "Red-tailed," he said to nobody in particular. "How do you know?" she asked. He glanced at her, slightly suspicious of the question. "The color. On its tail. Papa showed me." She looked at the field. The hawk was already gone. "I don't know birds," she said honestly. "I know fabric. I know what's wrong with a dress at 20 paces, but I couldn't tell a hawk from an eagle if they were sitting next to each other." Eli appeared to consider this. "Eagles are bigger," he said. "Good to know," she said. He sat back down, but the set of his shoulders had shifted by some small increment, the way a door shifts when someone has turned the handle but not yet pushed. She stored that away too. The next 2 weeks were harder than the first, and the first had been hard enough. She burned the beans twice. She let the fire go out one night, and the house was cold as a stone cellar by 3 in the morning, and Eli appeared at her doorway in 2 blankets saying nothing, and she put him on the end of her bed under the blue quilt and rebuilt the fire and didn't sleep again until dawn. After that, she set a mental alarm for midnight that worked maybe half the time. Danny, the young ranch hand, remained the particular problem of someone who wasn't hostile so much as constitutionally incapable of hiding what he thought. She'd catch him watching her carry water from the pump with an expression that was partly skeptical and partly just the specific assessment of someone deciding whether a new tool is going to hold up under real conditions. He found out she was a seamstress on a Wednesday when his work shirt tore along the shoulder seam during a fence repair, and she offered to fix it without being asked. He handed it over with the expression of someone humoring a situation, and she had it done in 10 minutes with a seam strong enough to outlast the shirt. He held it up and looked at the seam. Then he looked at her. "You did that fast." "I've been doing it a long time." He turned the shirt over, looked at it again. "My mother sews," he said. "It never looks like that." "Your mother probably taught herself. I had teachers who had teachers." She took back the thread from him. "Next time you tear something, bring it before it gets worse. A small tear takes 10 minutes. A big one takes an hour." He nodded. Something in his expression recalibrated. Not respect exactly, more like a reclassification. She'd gone from uncertain quantity to useful. For now, that was enough. Walt? She didn't need to win over in the same way. Walt watched, Walt observed, Walt arrived at his own conclusions in his own time, and you couldn't rush him any more than you could rush the weather. What she did notice was that by the end of the second week, he'd started leaving things for her. A split piece of kindling she'd been struggling with left already halved by the back door. A stuck window latch oiled without comment. A bucket placed under a roof drip she hadn't told anyone about, but had been dealing with alone. It was the frontier language of people who help through actions because words are expensive. She understood it and said nothing. Just nodded to him one morning over the fence, and he touched his hat brim. And that was that. Silas was the hardest to read of all. He wasn't unkind. She'd been careful about that from the start, not to frame him in her mind as a problem to solve or a wall to get around. He was a man who was doing the best he could under the specific conditions of his life, which included 2 years of grief and 40 acres and a son who'd stopped talking and a ranch that needed things he didn't have enough hours to provide. He worked from before dawn to after dark, and he was very good at it. She could see that in the way the horses responded to him, in the particular efficiency of how he moved around a problem. No wasted motion, no drama. He didn't complain. He didn't explain himself. He gave information when asked and otherwise got on with things, which in many contexts she would have called a virtue. But there was a wall. Not unfriendliness exactly, more like a careful distance he maintained the way you maintain a distance from something hot. Not because he was afraid of her specifically, because he was afraid of caring about anything in his immediate proximity, she thought. Because the last time he'd done that, it had ended in 3 days of fever and a grave outside of town. She didn't push it. She'd made her position clear on the first day. She wasn't here to be diminished, and she wasn't here to perform something she wasn't. The rest would take time or it wouldn't happen. She couldn't build a man's trust by deciding to. Trust was a thing that grew from consistent action, and she was focused on consistent action. What she hadn't expected was the day the 3-year-old mare got loose. It was a Thursday morning, 3 weeks in, and she was in the garden. The real gardening had started, turning soil, working in the compost she'd been building since day one. When she heard Danny shouting from the direction of the corral, she looked up to see the mare at full run crossing the field toward the road, gate swinging open behind her. Danny chasing on foot, which was both brave and completely futile. Silas was in the south field. Walt was somewhere she couldn't see. She assessed the situation in about 1.5 seconds. The road curved west, and the mare, if she hit it, would either run into the trees or onto the main road, and neither was good. She was not a horse person. She had not been on a horse in her life. She knew this about herself clearly. What she did instead was go directly to the east fence line, which ran parallel to the mare's trajectory, and move along it fast. And when the horse saw her and shied left, Nora waved her arms wide, which she was aware probably looked insane from any external viewpoint. The mare swerved right. Danny, coming from behind, was able to cut toward her. The mare ran another 30 yards, hit a muddy drainage ditch, thought better of everything, and stood there heaving while Danny caught the lead. Nora was breathing hard. Her boots were muddy to the ankle. Her hands were shaking slightly, which she noted with mild irritation. Danny looked at her across the field. He started laughing. Not meanly, just the release of adrenaline leaving a 19-year-old body too quickly. "You just—" He caught his breath. "You hurted her. You just— with your arms." "I know what I did," she said. "It worked. I'm aware." She was walking back to the garden when she heard boots behind her. She turned. Silas had come from the south field at some point during the incident. He'd seen the end of it, she realized. He was standing near the fence, looking at her. "You don't know horses," he said. "Not a bit," she confirmed, "but you figured out the angle." She looked back at the field, the drainage ditch, the fence line, the mare's likely path. "I look at things and figure out what they need," she said. "That's what I do. Doesn't matter if it's a dress or a horse or a—" She stopped, gestured vaguely at the garden. "All the same principle." Silas looked at her for a moment longer than usual. Not the cataloging look, not the checking if she's fine enough look. Something more direct than that. "You're not what I expected," he said. She considered this. "Was that a compliment?" "I'm not sure yet," he said. "Fair enough," she said, and went back to her garden. It wasn't until she'd been kneeling in the dirt for another 10 minutes, hands working the soil, that she noticed she was smiling, not a large smile. The small internal kind that happened before you made the decision to let it. 3 weeks in, and she had turned a mare from a fence line, won a child with bean taxonomy, and earned the provisional respect of a man who said 11 words a day. She had burned 2 batches of beans and let the fire go out once, and mispronounced 3 things in front of the townspeople, and been talked about behind fabric bolts by women who didn't know her name. The garden plot had 3 rows of turned earth now. She'd plant beans this week, the right kind, the kind that wouldn't sulk. Eli had asked to help. She'd said yes. The mountains behind the ranch stood in their usual indifferent magnificence, and the sky was the particular clean blue of a place that hadn't yet decided what to do with her. And Nora Whitmore, former resident of a storage closet, current resident of 40 acres of Wyoming, figured that was fair. She hadn't decided what to do with it either. They had time. The beans came up in June. Eli checked them every morning before school, crouching at the end of the row with the focused intensity of someone monitoring a situation that mattered. The first green shoots had appeared after 10 days, and he'd run to find Nora in the kitchen with an expression she hadn't seen on him yet. Open, unguarded, lit up from somewhere inside. "They're coming," he'd said. "I told you they would," she'd said. He'd looked at her with those careful brown eyes and said, "How did you know?" "I didn't," she said honestly. "But I planted them right, and that's all you can do. The rest is up to the beans." He'd thought about that for a moment and then gone back outside, and she'd stood at the kitchen window watching him crouch in the dirt and felt something settle in her chest that she didn't have a precise name for. Something in the vicinity of belonging, but quieter, more fragile. The kind of thing you didn't look at directly for fear of scaring it off. Things had found a rhythm by then, an imperfect, frequently aggravating rhythm, but a rhythm nonetheless. Breakfast at 6, Eli's lunch packed by 6:30, the morning work divided between the house and the garden, and whatever the ranch needed that fell within her growing competence. She'd learned the stove's temperament. She'd learned the pumps. She'd learned that Walt's silence meant approval and that Danny's running commentary meant the same thing, just louder. She'd learned that Silas took his coffee the same way she did, strong, no sugar, and that he read in the evening when Eli was asleep, sitting in the chair by the fire with a book held slightly too close to his face, which meant he probably needed spectacles and had not yet admitted it to himself. She didn't mention the spectacles. A man had to arrive at some truths on his own schedule. What she hadn't been prepared for was Victor Hale. She heard the name first from Danny, who mentioned it the way people mention a weather pattern. They've learned to watch. Not panicked, but attentive. Hale owned the largest spread in Lander County, 3,000 acres east of town, and had been buying up neighboring ranches for 2 years. Not aggressively, Danny said. Patiently. He'd wait until a man was desperate and then arrive with a number that was always less than fair and always slightly more than the man could refuse. "He come after Stone Ridge?" she asked. Danny glanced toward the south field where Silas was working. "He's been circling," he said carefully. "Sent a man out twice last year. Silas told him no both times." "And Hale accepted that?" Danny's expression gave her the answer before he spoke. "Hale doesn't accept things. He just changes his approach." She put that information in the same place she put other things she was still working out. Stored, not dismissed. She mentioned it to Silas that evening while he was washing up at the pump, which she'd learned was the best time to bring him a thing he didn't want to hear, when his hands were busy and he couldn't fold his arms. "Danny told me about Hale," she said. Silas didn't stop washing. "Danny talks too much. Danny talks the right amount. What's the situation with the ranch's debt?" He turned off the pump and reached for the towel on the fence post. She waited. She'd learned that too. That Silas's silences were not stonewalling, they were processing. And if you waited them out, something real usually followed. 2 years behind on a banknote, he said finally. Left over from when I expanded the corral and put in the new fencing. Eleanor, he stopped. Said the name the way people say names they're still not used to saying past tense. Eleanor got sick before I could get ahead of it. The medical costs went on top of everything else. "How much?" he told her. She didn't react visibly, which took some effort. It was a survivable number, but not without a plan and not without time, and men like Victor Hale were specifically in the business of making sure time ran out. "Has he made a direct offer recently?" she asked. "He sent a letter in March." Silas looked at the towel in his hands. "Month before I put the advertisement in the paper." She understood what he wasn't saying. The advertisement hadn't just been about Eli needing a woman's steadiness. A two-income household, or even the appearance of one, changed a bank's calculation. A man alone on a failing ranch was a risk. A man with a household was something sturdier, at least on paper. She wasn't offended by it. It was practical, and she understood practical. "All right," she said. "I want to see the letter." He looked at her. "The letter from Hale," she said, "and the banknote. Whatever paperwork you have." He brought it to her that night after Eli was in bed. A small stack of documents he'd clearly not looked at recently based on the way he set them on the table, like things he was relieved to put down. She went through them carefully, the way she went through a garment with a structural problem, looking for the seam that was failing. She found two things. The first was that the banknote had a grace provision that Silas either hadn't read closely or hadn't understood. There was language about a 60-day cure period before any foreclosure action could begin, which meant Hale couldn't simply buy the debt and move immediately. The second was that Hale's March letter referenced the ranch's current financial difficulties in a way that should not have been possible unless someone at the bank was sharing information they shouldn't be. She set the letter down and looked at it for a moment. "Someone at the bank is talking to Hale," she said. Silas sat forward. "What?" "He knows the specific amount of the shortfall. That's not public information." She tapped the letter. "Someone told him." The expression on Silas's face moved through several things quickly. Disbelief, then the specific anger of a man who's been blindsided by a betrayal he should have seen coming, then something harder and colder that settled in his jaw. "Caldwell," he said. "Who is loan officer at the bank? He and Hale grew up together." He said it through his teeth. I knew that, and I still, You didn't have another bank," she said, not unkindly. "No." He put his hands flat on the table. "No, I didn't." They sat with that for a moment. "The 60-day provision is real," she said. "That buys time. What I'd want to know is whether there's a way to restructure the note with a different lender before Hale can act." "There's no bank in Lander that Hale doesn't have some connection to." "Then not a bank in Lander." She looked at the documents again. "I had clients in Cheyenne. 2 of them were bankers' wives. I know things about those men that their loan officers don't." She caught his expression and added, "Nothing illegal, just relationships. People I did good work for who said if I ever needed anything." She'd never called in such a favor in her life. She'd been too proud, or too resigned, or both. "I could write letters." Silas looked at her. The lamplight made shadows of things, softened his expression into something she hadn't seen from him before. Not quite vulnerable. More like a man who had been carrying something alone for so long that the suggestion of sharing the weight was almost disorienting. "You do that," he said, not skeptically. More like he was testing the reality of it. "I'm already doing it," she said. "Now let me finish reading." She was still at the table at 11 o'clock when she heard the sound. At first she thought it was the wind, which had picked up through the evening and was doing something to the shutters on the south side. But the quality of it was wrong. Too orange, too shifting. She looked up from the documents and looked at the window, and for one very still second, she simply could not process what she was seeing. The barn was on fire. She was at the door before she'd made the conscious decision to move, screaming for Silas, who was already coming down the hall. He'd smelled it before she'd seen it, she realized later. The particular instinct of someone who'd lived around livestock long enough that fire registered in the body before the brain. He went past her at a run. Danny and Walt came from the bunkhouse. The horses were the immediate problem. 3 horses in a burning barn is not a problem you think through. It is a problem you run directly at, and she watched Silas go through the barn door into the smoke and felt something clench in her ribcage that was not abstract at all. She grabbed the water bucket from beside the pump and started filling it. Then another. She wasn't strong enough to do what the men were doing. She knew that and didn't argue with it. But she could keep water coming, and she could keep her head, and that was what she did. Bucket after bucket, relayed down a line she organized without quite deciding to organize it, Danny on one end, Walt on the other, Nora working the pump until her arms shook. They got the horses out. They lost the east wall and part of the loft. By the time it was properly out, and the structure was just a shell of smoking beams, the sky was the false gray of pre-dawn, and all 4 of them were standing in the yard covered in soot, breathing hard. Eli was on the porch in his nightshirt. He'd woken up at some point and had the sense to stay out of the way, which she only appreciated later. In the moment she saw him and went directly to him and put herself between him and the view of the ruined barn without quite thinking about it. "The horses?" he asked. His voice was very small. "All out," she said. "Everyone's fine. He leaned against her side. She put her arm around his shoulders and held him there and looked at the ruin of the barn over his head. Behind her she could hear Silas and Walt talking in low voices. Something in Walt's tone was wrong. Too careful, too specific. She sent Eli inside. Then she went to them. "What is it?" she asked. Walt was looking at the base of the east wall where the fire had started. Even she could see it. The burn pattern was different there, too concentrated, starting from the outside. "Set," Walt said. The word fell into the morning like a stone into cold water. Silas was very still. She knew that stillness by now. Not calm, the opposite of calm. The stillness of something under enormous pressure. "You're sure?" he said to Walt. "Been farming 30 years, Walt said. "I know what an accident looks like, and I know what this looks like." Nora looked at the burn pattern. She thought about the letter on the table inside. She thought about current financial difficulties and the loan officer who'd grown up with Victor Hale. "He's escalating," she said. "You don't know it was Hale," Silas said. "No," she said. "But you do." He turned away from her. She watched him walk toward the ruined barn and stop at its edge, hands on his hips, looking at the damage. The set of his shoulders was wrong. She'd seen it before, not often, but enough times to recognize what it meant. The particular posture of a man who is about to make a decision from the worst possible part of himself. She let him stand there for a moment. Then she walked to him. "Silas, I can't do this," he'd said. His voice was very flat. "I can't keep—" He stopped. This was Eleanor's barn. She picked where it went. She said the light was better on the east side of the house, and she was right. And now it's... He stopped again. His jaw was tight enough to crack something. She stood beside him and looked at the ruin. "I know," she said. "You should go back east," he said. This isn't what you signed up for." "You don't know what I signed up for." "Nora." He turned to face her and she saw what he was actually doing. Not pushing her away out of indifference, pushing her away because he was afraid. Because there were now things on this property that he'd let himself start to care about again, and the barn was evidence of what caring about things cost. "I'm serious. Take Eli to town if you want. Take the wagon. I'll—" "Stop," she said. He stopped. "I'm not leaving," she said. "Not because of a fire, and not because you're scared and trying to clear the area." She kept her voice level, the way you keep your voice level around frightened animals and frightened men, because the register matters as much as the words. "I didn't come this far to run when things got hard. This is different from hard. I know it's different. I've read the letter and I've seen the burn pattern and I understand what we're dealing with. And I'm still standing here telling you I'm not leaving." She looked at him directly, the way she'd looked at him on the first day on the platform. Clearly, without apology for what he was seeing. "The question is whether you're going to stand here with me or spend the next week trying to convince me to go." He looked at her for a long time. The sun was coming up behind the mountains now, the slow gray gold beginning that Wyoming did without ceremony. The ruined barn was a dark silhouette against it. "You're the most stubborn woman I've ever met," he said. "I've been told that," she said. It wasn't a complaint. She looked at him. Something in his face was different from the first day, and from the early weeks, and even from the night she'd gone through the documents with him. Something that had been behind glass was slightly less behind glass. He looked away first. He looked at the barn, at the field, at the mountains. She could almost see him doing the math. The debt, the bank, Hale, the 60-day provision, the letters she'd said she would write. "The Cheyenne bankers," he said. "I'll write today. It might not work." "It might not," she agreed. "But it's something, and something is more than nothing, and we have 60 days. Walt appeared behind them, 2 cups of coffee from somewhere. She suspected her own kitchen, which meant he'd gone in and made it himself, which was such a Walt solution to a crisis that she almost smiled. He handed them each a cup and said, "East wall can be rebuilt." Then he walked back toward the bunkhouse, which was the most words she'd heard him string together since she arrived. She and Silas stood in the new morning with their coffee and the smell of smoke and the ruined barn between them and the mountain, not touching, not needing to. Inside the house, she could hear Eli in the kitchen, the particular sound of a small boy trying to be quiet while clearly making something. A chair pushed out, a cupboard opened and carefully closed. He was making breakfast, she realized. In the way of a child who doesn't know what else to do when the world has been frightening in the night, but knows that morning has a shape and the shape involves food. She looked at Silas. He'd heard it too. He didn't say anything, but he turned from the barn and walked toward the house, and she walked beside him, and neither of them said anything about what was still unfinished or what was coming or what Hale would do next. There was a child making breakfast in the kitchen. That was the thing that was true right now. The rest could wait 40 minutes. Eli had made toast, slightly burned on one side, which he presented with the expression of someone who understood the product was imperfect, but stood behind it anyway. Silas ate it without comment. Nora ate hers and said it was good, which was not entirely a lie because the unburned side was fine, and Eli sat across from them both and watched them eat with the quiet attention of a child taking inventory of whether the morning was going to be all right. It was going to be all right, for this morning, anyway. After breakfast, she wrote the letters. She wrote 3. One to Mrs. Hattie Drummond in Cheyenne, whose husband ran a small but solvent lending firm that had nothing to do with Lander County or its politics. One to Mrs. Frances Weld, whose brother-in-law had done well in Denver land finance. And one to a woman named Josephine Park, who was the sharpest person Nora had ever fitted a dress for, and who had mentioned once, in the specific conspiratorial tone of women sharing real information, that she had connections in the territorial land office that she'd never found the right occasion to use. The letters were not long. She was specific about what she needed and honest about what she was offering: a legitimate debt restructure, a performing ranch with real assets, and the opportunity to do business outside Victor Hale's influence in a county where Hale had made himself unpopular with everyone who wasn't directly benefiting from him. She sealed them, addressed them, and gave them to Silas to mail when he went for supplies. Then she went back to work, because the letters were either going to produce something or they weren't, and in the meantime, the ranch still had to function. The next 2 weeks had a different quality from the weeks before. Something had shifted after the fire, not between her and Silas exactly, but in the overall atmosphere of Stone Ridge. The barn's ruin was visible from almost everywhere on the property, a constant reminder of what had happened and what was still possible. Danny had stopped being casually dismissive in the way young men are casually dismissive of things they don't fully understand. Walt moved through the days with a new watchfulness, his eyes going to the road more frequently than before. Even the town had changed slightly. She'd gone in with Silas the Thursday after the fire, and Mrs. Greer had looked at her differently, not warmly, not yet, but with a recalibrated expression. Word had gotten out about the fire and its suspected cause. And apparently there were people in Lander who had been waiting a long time for someone to say plainly what everyone privately understood about Victor Hale. She was in the dry goods store when a woman she didn't know touched her elbow. "You're the one at Stone Ridge," the woman said. She was maybe 45, weathered and direct in the way of women who'd been managing frontier households since before Nora had learned to thread a needle. "Nora Whitmore," she said. "Margaret Cole. My husband's spread is north of yours." The woman looked at her with frank, assessing eyes. "I heard you went through the documents, found the grace provision." "I did." Nobody else in 2 years thought to look at the paperwork. Margaret Cole said this without particular warmth or praise, just the observation of someone noting a fact. Hales bought 4 ranches in this county. Every single time, the owner panicked and took the number without reading the note. She paused. "I've been telling Frank for a year that somebody needed to look at the actual documents." "It's not complicated," Nora said. "It just takes patience. Most people don't have patience when they're scared." Margaret Cole looked at her for one more moment. "You need anything? You send word to the Cole Ranch. Frank would want to know. There are more of us watching Hale than he thinks." She was gone before Nora could respond, but the weight of those words, "more of us watching than he thinks," stayed with her on the ride back to Stone Ridge, turning over in her mind alongside everything else. Hale had been operating on the assumption that the ranches in his vicinity were isolated from each other. Desperate men didn't collaborate. They survived alone or they didn't survive, and either way they weren't comparing notes. It was a reasonable assumption based on everything that had come before. He hadn't accounted for a woman who spent her adult life in other people's parlors, understanding the way information moved between people who trusted each other. The first letter back came 8 days after she'd sent hers. It was from Josephine Park, written in the decisive hand of someone who'd been waiting for exactly this kind of problem. Josephine knew a man in Cheyenne, not a banker, a private lender, someone who dealt in exactly the kind of situation Nora had described, who had in fact been looking for investment opportunities in Lander County that predated Hale's consolidation. She included the man's name and address and a personal note that read simply, "Tell him I sent you. He owes me a considerable favor, and this will settle it nicely." Nora read the letter twice and then went to find Silas. He was in the corral working with the young mare, the same mare that had run 3 weeks ago, now responding to him with considerably more cooperation, which was the result of whatever quiet negotiations Silas conducted with horses that she still didn't entirely understand. He was patient with them in a way that was almost invisible, the way patience is when it's not performing itself. She stood at the fence rail. He finished what he was doing, gave the mare some time, and came to her. She handed him the letter. He read it. His expression shifted while he read. Not dramatically, but she'd gotten good at reading the small movements of his face by now. "Josephine Park," he said. "I fitted her spring wardrobe for 3 years. She never paid late, and she tipped well, and she told me once that she kept information the way other women kept china, carefully, for when it mattered." He was quiet for a moment, looking at the letter. This lender, he'd want security. The land itself is the security. 40 acres of Lander County land is worth more than you owe right now, and it'll be worth more in 5 years. That's a good investment for him. She kept her voice steady. The only question is whether he acts before Caldwell tips off Hale that we're shopping the note. Then we move fast. Yes. He folded the letter, looked at her over it. The same look from the morning after the fire. Something behind glass and slightly less behind glass. You've done this before, this kind of negotiating. No, she said. I've watched it done. And I've spent 30 years being underestimated by people who thought I wasn't paying attention. She took the letter back. I was always paying attention. She wrote to the Cheyenne lender that evening. Silas added his signature. They sent it by the fastest post available, and then did the only reasonable thing, which was continue working and not spend the days thinking too hard about what they couldn't control. The reply from Cheyenne took 6 days. In those 6 days, Victor Hale came to Stone Ridge. She was in the garden. The beans were knee-high now, the tomatoes staked and climbing, the whole plot looking like something intentional rather than hopeful, when she heard the wagon on the road. She straightened up and looked. It was a good wagon. Better than good. The kind of wagon that announced money without saying it directly, with matched horses and a driver up front and 2 men on the back bench who sat the way men sit when they're being paid to look large and unhurried. The man who stepped down from the passenger seat was around 55, with silver hair under a good hat, and the particular build of a man who had been physically capable when young and now carried the same confidence in a softer frame. He had a pleasant face, which she didn't trust because the most dangerous people she had met in her life had pleasant faces. Silas was out of the south field before Hale reached the porch. She watched from the garden. She could hear well enough from where she stood, and she wanted to see both of them without being immediately visible herself. "Mercer," Hale said. His voice was the voice of a man accustomed to controlling the shape of conversations. "I heard about the barn. Shame about that. Terrible thing." "Mr. Hale," Silas said. His voice gave nothing. "I wanted to come personally, offer my sympathies, and—" Hale paused in the way of a man who knows a pause is a tool. "Given the circumstances, I thought it was worth revisiting our previous conversation. My offer stands. In fact, given your current situation, I'd be willing to improve it slightly." "My current situation," Silas said. "The note, the barn, man alone with a child and a—" Another pause. Hale's eyes went briefly toward the garden, found her standing there, and he adjusted his expression by a fraction that most people wouldn't notice. "A household arrangement," he finished. She walked to the porch fence and leaned on it. She didn't hurry. She took her time, the way you take your time when you want someone to understand that you are not responding to pressure, you are simply deciding when to respond. "Mr. Hale," she said. He turned to her fully. Something moved through his eyes. Assessment, then the specific recalibration men like him did when a variable turned out to be different from what they'd planned for. "Ma'am," he said. "You mentioned the note," she said. "Have you spoken to Mr. Caldwell recently?" His expression didn't change. That told her what she needed to know. He'd expected either not to be asked or to be asked by someone he could dismiss. He hadn't expected the question from her, and he hadn't expected it said so directly. "I know people at most banks in the territory," he said pleasantly. "That's just business." "Of course it is," she said. She put her hands on the fence rail. "Then you probably know that the note has a 60-day cure provision and that we're well within that window. And you probably know that we've been in contact with outside lenders who are very interested in Lander County land that isn't already tied up in your portfolio." She watched his face. "So I'm not sure what the basis of your improved offer is exactly." A silence. Not a comfortable one. Hale's pleasant expression stayed in place. He was good, she gave him that. But something behind it had shifted. The two men on the wagon back had gone very still in the way of men waiting to read a situation. "You seem well informed," Hale said. "I am," she said simply. Silas said nothing. She was aware of him beside her, not behind her, not stepping in front of her. Beside her, which was exactly where she needed him to be. Hale looked at Silas. "This your wife speaking for you, Mercer?" "This is Nora Whitmore speaking for herself," Silas said. "Same as she always does. I happen to agree with everything she just said." Hale's smile had gone from pleasant to something else. Not angry, controlled. "You have 60 days and no guarantee of your outside financing," he said. He wasn't addressing her now, he was addressing Silas, which was a choice she noted carefully. A lot can happen in 60 days on a ranch. Accidents happen. Weather happens. The word accidents fell between them like something he'd put there on purpose. Nora had been holding herself very still. Now she moved. She went into the house. She came back out in 90 seconds. She was carrying the Winchester rifle that she'd found on the rack inside the front door the first week, and had subsequently learned to load and fire with Walt's extremely brief and efficient instruction. Because she had decided on day 2 at Stone Ridge that she was going to learn every practical skill this land required of her, without exception. She didn't raise it. She held it in both hands, muzzle toward the ground, standing at the edge of the porch. She looked at Hale steadily. "You mentioned accidents," she said. "I want to make sure I understood you correctly." Behind Hale, his driver had sat up straighter. The two men on the bench were reading the situation very fast. Hale looked at the rifle, then at her face. She watched him understand something, that she was not performing, that she had measured this moment and arrived at it deliberately and was not going to be read as hysteria or desperation because she was neither. She was a woman who had spent 3 months learning how to survive this land and had just gotten very clear about what she would protect. "I meant weather," he said. "Literally. Storms this time of year can be damaging." "Of course," she said. "Thank you for clarifying." He held her gaze for 3 seconds. Then he turned back to Silas. "Think about it," he said, in the tone of a man who was choosing to let something go for now. "The offer won't stay open indefinitely." "Noted," Silas said. Hale got back into the wagon. The driver turned it around without hurrying, because hurrying would have been an acknowledgement of something. They went back down the road the way they'd come. She and Silas stood on the porch and watched them go. The rifle was heavier than it looked. Her arms were shaking slightly, which she had not let show while Hale was there and was now allowing herself to acknowledge. "You know how to use that?" Silas said. "Walt showed me," she said. A pause. "Walt has never, in 4 years of working for me, voluntarily taught anyone anything." "I asked 3 times," she said. "Walt responds to persistence." Another pause. Longer. Then Silas made a sound that she had not heard from him before. A short, quiet sound that was somewhere between exhalation and something else. Not quite a laugh. Almost a laugh. The sound of a man who had forgotten that particular response was available to him. She set the rifle against the porch post. Her hands had steadied. "He'll come back," Silas said. "Yes," she said. "But now he knows what he's coming back to." The letter from the Cheyenne lender arrived 2 days later. He was interested. He wanted to meet. He named a number for the restructured note that was workable. Not easy, but workable, which was all she'd asked for. Margaret Cole sent word through her husband that 3 other ranchers in the county had agreed to give formal statements about Hale's methods to the Territorial Land Office, which Josephine Parks' contact had apparently been wanting for 2 years and had never had enough parties willing to go on record. The dominoes were not all standing yet, but some of them were wobbling. That evening, she sat at the kitchen table with the Cheyenne letter and her own notes and the ranch's account book, which she had taken to keeping with Silas's grudging permission and then his genuine relief, and she worked through the numbers the way she used to work through a difficult alteration, not forcing it, just looking for where the thing wanted to go, where the excess was and where the structure was sound and what would hold if you rebuilt it right. Eli appeared at her elbow at some point and sat down beside her without asking, the way he'd taken to doing in the evenings. He had a book about birds. She'd ordered it from the dry goods catalog 3 weeks ago and not mentioned she was doing it. And when it arrived, he'd looked at it for a long moment and then looked at her and not said anything, which was his version of something quite large. He was looking at the hawk page now. "Red-tailed," she said, without looking up from the accounts. "You remembered," he said. "I told you I was a quick learner." He turned the page. She kept working. Silas came in from outside and stopped in the doorway of the kitchen. She could feel him stop without looking up, the way you can feel a room change when someone enters it and stand still. She looked up. He was looking at the 2 of them at the table, Eli with his bird book, Nora with her accounts, and her pencil and the lamp burning between them. An ordinary domestic scene that had assembled itself without anyone planning it. His face was doing the thing where it was very quiet on the surface and working hard underneath. "There's coffee," she said. He came in and sat down. The meeting in Cheyenne happened on a Tuesday in late July, which meant Silas was gone for 3 days and Nora ran Stone Ridge alone. She had not planned to find this alarming, and she didn't, which surprised her slightly. 4 months ago, she had been a woman who had never started a fire that needed to last through a Wyoming night, never managed 2 grown men's work schedules, never negotiated with anyone more difficult than a client who wanted her waist taken in past the point the fabric would allow. Now she woke before dawn, checked the animals, directed Danny and Walt through the morning work, kept Eli fed and moving toward school, managed the accounts, tended the garden, and went to bed tired in the specific, satisfying way of a body that had done actual things. Danny had stopped looking at her like an uncertain variable. He looked at her now the way you look at someone whose judgment you've decided to trust, which had happened gradually and then all at once, the way most real things happen. Walt said, on the second morning Silas was gone, "You know you've got this handled." And she understood that from Walt this was roughly equivalent to a formal commendation. "I know," she said. "Just thought it was worth saying," he said, and went back to his fence post. She thought about that for the rest of the day. Not because she needed the validation. She'd stopped needing external confirmation of her own competence sometime around the 3rd week at Stone Ridge, when she'd realized the land didn't care what her sisters thought of her, but because it mattered, in a specific way, that the people who had watched her work had arrived at their conclusions honestly. Nobody had given Danny or Walt a reason to trust her. She'd built it the way you build anything real, slowly, imperfectly, through consistent action and the willingness to be wrong and try again. Silas came back on Thursday evening with the signed documents from the Cheyenne lender and an expression that was doing several things at once. She was in the kitchen when she heard the wagon. She didn't rush to the door. She finished what she was doing, wiped her hands, and went out to the porch. He climbed down and looked at her. She looked at him. Neither of them spoke for a moment because the moment had a specific weight, and both of them recognized it. "It went through," he said. "I know it did," she said. "Your face would look different if it hadn't." Something moved through his expression that was almost amusement, and also something deeper than amusement. "The rate is higher than I wanted. It's manageable." "Yes." He had the signed documents in his hand. He looked down at them for a moment, then back at her. "Caldwell is finished. The Territorial Bank Office is reviewing his conduct. Josephine Parks' contact moved fast once we gave him the paper trail." "Good." "Nora." He said her name the way he'd said it only a few times, carefully, like he was making sure of it. "I need to tell you something." She waited. "When I put that advertisement in the paper," he said, "I was doing it for Eli." That was the honest truth. I told myself it was a practical arrangement, and I meant it, and I was not wrong about that. But he stopped, restarted, which he almost never did. I've been telling myself a lot of things this year that were easier to believe than the actual thing. What's the actual thing? She asked. He looked at her steadily. That I stopped wanting to be alone about 2 months ago, and I've been pretending I didn't notice. The evening was doing its Wyoming thing behind him. Long light across the field, the mountains purple and enormous, the sky a color she still didn't have a name for that was somewhere between gold and the memory of gold. She looked at him. This man who was not easy, who had never once pretended to be, who read in the evenings with a book held too close to his face and was patient with horses in a way he hadn't yet learned to be patient with himself. Who had 2 years of grief sitting in his chest like a stone he'd stopped trying to move but hadn't lost. Who had told her on the first day that he couldn't promise anything except honesty, and had kept that promise even when honesty cost him something. I know, she said. I've been watching you not notice for 2 months. He looked at her for a long moment. That obvious? Only to someone paying attention, she said. He crossed the distance between them, not dramatically, not rushing, just closed the space with the same economy of motion he brought to everything. And when he kissed her, it was not perfect, because he misjudged the angle slightly, and she was taller than he'd apparently been calculating for, and she laughed into it before she could stop herself. And then he laughed too, the real laugh she'd heard only twice before, and it turned into something genuine rather than something performed, which was better. They were still standing on the porch when Eli appeared in the doorway behind them, assessed the situation with the uncanny perceptiveness of children who have been paying very close attention to the adults in their lives for months, and said, without particular surprise, "Are you going to get married now?" Silas looked at Nora. Nora looked at Silas. "That's a reasonable question," she said. "I'll take that as a yes," Eli said, and went back inside to finish his supper. The actual wedding happened 6 weeks later, on a Saturday morning in September, at the Lander County Courthouse with Walt and Danny as witnesses, and Margaret Cole, who had arrived uninvited and absolutely correctly, standing in the back with her husband Frank and an expression of grim satisfaction. Mrs. Greer from the dry goods store came also, which surprised Nora until she remembered that Mrs. Greer had been watching everything very carefully since May and had clearly arrived at her own conclusions. It was not a beautiful ceremony in any conventional sense. The judge was running late. Eli had mud on his good shirt from an incident with the water trough that morning, and Nora's dress was her own work, altered, let out, rebuilt from something she'd had for years into something that fit her actual body, rather than the body she'd spent 2 decades wishing for. She had stopped making herself smaller in that dress. She had taken out every seam and cut that had been designed to minimize and rebuilt the whole thing to fit what she actually was. And when she put it on that morning, she had stood in front of the small mirror in her room and looked at herself without the usual catalog of grievances. She looked like herself. That was all. It was enough. Victor Hale came to town that same week, which she did not plan, but also did not find surprising. He came not to Stone Ridge this time, but to the land office directly, with a lawyer from out of territory and documentation he'd apparently been preparing for some time. A claim that the original deed to Stone Ridge had an error in the survey line that placed a portion of the most valuable grazing land technically within a disputed boundary. It was not a new strategy. It was exactly the kind of quiet legal trap Danny had warned her about in the beginning, the kind of thing that didn't require fire or intimidation, just paperwork and a judge who owed you something. She heard about it from Margaret Cole on a Thursday morning, 36 hours after the filing, and by Thursday afternoon she was in the land office with the ranch's original deed and 3 years' worth of property tax records, and a letter from Josephine Park's contact at the territorial office that she had requested 2 weeks ago, on the instinct that Hale would try something of this nature and that having the right documentation assembled before it was needed was better than scrambling for it after. The land office clerk, a young man named Peters, who had been in the job for 18 months and was visibly uncomfortable with all of it, looked at the stack of documents she placed on his counter. The survey discrepancy he's citing, she said, was corrected in 1881. There's a recorded amendment to the original deed on file with the territorial office. She placed that document on top of the stack. The tax records show continuous payment on the full parcel for 11 years, which establishes legal possession under territorial statute even if the original survey had been in error, which it wasn't. She placed those on top, and this letter from the territorial office indicates that Mr. Hale's lawyer, a Mr. Price from Denver, has filed similar survey challenges in 4 other counties in the past 3 years, all of which were subsequently dismissed. She placed the letter on top of everything. I'd like to request that this filing be reviewed before any action is taken and that the Territorial Oversight Office be formally notified, which they've asked to be when Mr. Price's name appears on any filing in this territory. Peters looked at the documents. He looked at her. He was very young, and he was trying to figure out what to do with this, and she almost felt sorry for him. "I'll need to review these," he said. "Of course," she said pleasantly. "I'll wait." She sat down on the bench along the wall and folded her hands in her lap and waited. Silas was outside with Walt. He'd offered to come in and she'd said she had it, and he'd looked at her for a moment and then said, "All right," and gone to wait with Walt, because he'd learned by now what she meant when she said she had something and that it was not false confidence. She waited 40 minutes. Peters reviewed the documents with 2 other clerks in considerable low-voiced discussion. At the end of 40 minutes, he came back to the counter. "The survey amendment appears to be valid and correctly recorded," he said, in the careful tone of a young official who is delivering a result he did not expect and is not entirely comfortable with. "The challenge would need substantially more documentation to proceed." "Thank you," she said. "Mr. Hale's lawyer may refile with additional—" "He's welcome to try," she said. She stood up and gathered the documents that weren't staying on file. "But I'd encourage you to note for your records that we will respond to every filing promptly and completely, and that the Territorial Oversight Office has been copied on today's interaction as well." She picked up her bag. "Good afternoon." She walked out into the September sun, where Silas was leaning against the wagon with his arms folded, and Walt was sitting on the wagon bench looking at nothing specific. "Done?" Silas asked. "Filing dismissed," she said, "or will be. Hale can refile, but he won't. He's out of clean moves." Silas looked at her for a moment. Walt looked at her from the wagon bench. "Ma'am?" Walt said. That was all. But from Walt, it was everything. Hale left Lander County before the end of the year. Not loudly. Men like Hale never left loudly. He simply redirected his attention toward territory further west, where the ranchers were more isolated and the county records were less carefully maintained. The Cole Ranch was safe. 2 of the other families who'd given statements to the territorial office were able to recover their debt situations once Caldwell's misconduct was formally investigated and a new loan officer was installed at the bank. Not everyone recovered. That was the truth of it. 2 ranches had already been signed over before any of this happened, and those families were gone, and there was nothing Nora could do about that except know it and carry it. The land didn't offer clean endings. It offered the continuation of work. The barn was rebuilt before winter, not the same as it had been. The east wall came back stronger, new timber, better bracing. Walt oversaw it with the same minimal commentary he brought to everything, and Danny worked alongside 2 men Silas hired from town. And by the first week of November, it stood solid against the gray sky, with the particular look of a structure that had been tested and rebuilt and would not be easily burned again. Eli helped where he could, which mostly meant handing Walt tools and asking questions that Walt answered with his characteristic economy. But she noticed that Walt answered all of them, every single one. And once or twice she caught Eli writing things down in the small notebook he'd taken to carrying, which she suspected had something to do with the bird books and something to do with the specific hunger of a child who had decided the world was worth paying attention to again. She thought about that a great deal, about the 6-year-old boy who had stopped talking when he lost his mother and had slowly, over the course of a strange summer, started talking again. Not because she had fixed anything, because she hadn't, and not because she had replaced anyone, because that wasn't possible and she had never tried, but because she had shown up every day and been genuinely, consistently present, and sometimes that is the only thing available to offer, and it turns out to be enough. She thought about her sisters less than she expected to. Clara had written once, in July, a letter that was half apology and half self-justification and fully Clara. Nora had written back briefly, that she was well, that the ranch was good, that Eli had a notebook about birds. She had not said you were right to send me here because that wasn't the truth, and Clara didn't deserve the credit. She had not said you were cruel because that was the truth, but saying it wouldn't change anything. She had said I'm well and meant it, which was more than she'd been able to say honestly from the storage closet on Caldwell Street, and that was enough. Some wounds don't close. They just stop defining you. On the last night of October, after Eli was asleep and the fire was doing its reliable thing for once, she and Silas sat at the kitchen table with the account book and the last of the coffee and the specific quiet of a house that had settled into itself. The numbers were not perfect. They never would be. There was a good winter ahead and then a spring that would bring its own complications. And the note to the Cheyenne lender had years left on it, and ranching was not a life that offered security so much as the ongoing negotiation between effort and circumstance. She knew that now. She had learned it the hard way, which was the only way the land offered. "You're thinking," Silas said. "Always," she said. "About what?" She looked at the account book, then at the window, which showed her nothing but her own reflection and the dark beyond it. She thought about what she had been when she boarded a train in April with 2 trunks and her mother's blue quilt, tired and practical and too stubborn to be resigned, going west toward a stranger and a land that didn't know her name. She thought about the word worth, which she had heard applied to her entire life in ways that were almost always wrong. People measuring her against a scale she hadn't agreed to, finding her lacking by standards she'd never accepted, tallying up her weight and her marital status and her address, and arriving at a number they were satisfied with. She had spent 31 years being told, in ways large and small, what she was worth. She had spent the last 6 months finding out. "I was thinking," she said, "that next year we should expand the garden, south side. There's good sun there and the soil's not been worked." Silas looked at her. The lamplight did what it always did, and his face was the face she'd learned to read. Imperfectly, still, because he was not a simple man, and she didn't expect to finish understanding him. But she knew the difference now between his quiet and his closed off, between the working underneath silence and the shutting down silence, and this was the former. "That's a lot of work," he said. "I know," she said. "I'm not afraid of work." "No," he said. "You're not." He reached across the table and put his hand over hers. Not dramatically, not with any particular ceremony, just the gesture of a man who had decided something and was done deciding it in private. She turned her hand over and held his. They sat like that for a while, 2 imperfect people in an imperfect house, at the edge of a hard and beautiful land, with the accounts spread out between them, and the fire working steadily, and a boy asleep in the back room who had a notebook full of birds and a garden in the spring to look forward to, and enough security in his small chest now to sleep deeply instead of lightly. This was not the ending she had imagined in April, standing on a platform with 2 trunks in a town she'd never heard of. She hadn't allowed herself to imagine an ending at all. That had felt too much like optimism, and optimism had always cost her something. But here was the thing about Stone Ridge country, about the particular quality of land that asked everything and softened for no one. It didn't give you the life you'd pictured. It gave you the life you built, piece by piece, with your own hands and your own stubbornness, and the occasional help of people who surprised you. And years later, because there were years later, many of them, the people of Lander County would tell the story of Stone Ridge Ranch, the way people tell stories about things that become part of a place's identity, worked into the fabric of its history like a good, strong seam. They would say a rancher had nearly lost everything and instead built one of the most stable homesteads in the territory. They would talk about the barn that was burned and rebuilt stronger. They would mention the Cheyenne deal and the land office filing and the day Victor Hale drove back down a ranch road without getting what he came for. And when they told the story, they would not say the mail-order bride. They would not say the woman from back east. They would not say any of the things that had been said on her first day in the dry goods store, behind the fabric bolts, by women who had measured her against a scale she'd never agreed to. They would say, Nora Mercer. And they would say it the way you say the name of someone who mattered, someone who stayed, someone who looked at a broken thing and found the seam that was failing and fixed it with steady hands and refused to call it extraordinary because to her it had never been extraordinary. It had just been the work. It had always just been the work. But here was the thing about Stone Ridge country, about the particular quality of land that asked everything and softened for no one. It didn't give you the life you'd pictured. It gave you the life you built, piece by piece, with your own hands and your own stubbornness and the occasional help of people who surprised you. And years later, because there were years later, many of them, The people of Lander County would tell the story of Stone Ridge Ranch, the way people tell stories about things that become part of a place's identity, worked into the fabric of its history like a good strong seam. They would say a rancher had nearly lost everything and instead built one of the most stable homesteads in the territory. They would talk about the barn that was burned and rebuilt stronger. They would mention the Cheyenne deal and the land office filing and the day Victor Hale drove back down a ranch road without getting what he came for. And when they told the story, they would not say the mail-order bride. They would not say the woman from back east. They would not say any of the things that had been said on her first day in the dry goods store, behind the fabric bolts, by women who had measured her against a scale she'd never agreed to. They would say, Nora Mercer. And they would say it the way you say the name of someone who mattered, someone who stayed, someone who looked at a broken thing and found the seam that was failing and fixed it with steady hands and refused to call it extraordinary because to her, it had never been extraordinary. It had just been the work. It had always just been the work.